Imagine standing on the edge of a dark and endless ocean in the 15th century, staring into a void with no map, no GPS, and no promise of returning. If you miscalculate by just a few degrees, you drift for weeks. If the wind stops, the sun claims you. Sail too far. And the sea itself might swallow you into horizons that never lead back home. The ocean was a giant question mark. For ages, these waters were walls keeping the world small. But within a single century, those walls became highways. The age of exploration from the early 1400s to the late 1600s was like the Big Bang of globalization. It connected continents, changed the food on your plate, reshaped cultures, and shifted the balance of power by permanently linking the world's lands into one connected global network. The people who built this global change did not start at the top. They were the most unlikely leaders. In the early 1400s, Europe was not the powerful superpower it would one day become. Compared to the shining wealth of Ming China, the mighty Ottoman Empire, or the gold-rich kingdoms of West Africa, Europe was a broken and arguing backwater. But they had one big obsession. The wealth of the world flowed along the Silk Road. If you lived in Europe and wanted silk from China or precious gems from India, it meant depending on a huge overland network of camel caravans crossing Asia. By the time these treasures reached the Eastern Mediterranean, the powerful sea republics of Venice and Genoa controlled the flow. They sold these goods to the rest of Europe at a shocking markup. The ultimate prize was spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves. A single sack was worth a fortune. To get them, you paid a huge cut to Arab, Turkish, and Italian middlemen. Meanwhile, at the opposite end of the continent, sitting on the very edge of the known world, was the Kingdom of Portugal, economically poor and geographically cut off. Portugal was squeezed between hostile Castile and the vast unmapped void of the Atlantic Ocean. They were blocked from expanding east and completely shut out of the profitable Mediterranean spice trade. But desperation breeds ambition to survive and grow. Portugal needed to find its own source of gold. This tiny strip of land became the launching pad that changed history. From the edge of Europe, they decided to do the unthinkable, use the dangerous waters to stretch their reach halfway around the globe. Portugal also had something else: political will. A royal prince named Henry, later known as Henry the Navigator, became the driving force behind a focused obsession with the horizon. The year is 1415. Portugal captures the North African port of Ceuta. Inside, they witness caravans from deep in the Sahara loaded with gold and spices. They realize the continent's vast wealth is completely passing them by. But for Henry, wealth was only half the story. Driven by the spirit of the Crusades, he wanted to go around Eastern empires. It was the ultimate medieval combination. A clash of religious faith and raw greed. Henry rarely sailed himself. Instead, he poured wealth into Lisbon's docks, buying the world's best maps and using mathematics to go around the caravans and reach the source directly. But a huge mental barrier stood in the way: the Sea of Darkness. Sailors believed that beyond Cape Bojador, the ocean boiled and the winds never allowed a return. In 1434, Captain Gil Eanes pushed through the fear and finally crossed the Cape. He proved the ocean did not boil. He broke a barrier that had trapped Europe for centuries. But returning home revealed a new technical problem. Traditional Mediterranean ships were useless against the constant southbound winds of the open Atlantic. The solution was the caravel, light and shallow. It used triangular Arabian lateen sails. For the first time, European sailors could catch the wind at an angle and zigzag forward against it. By mastering the wind, they invented a daring move called the Volta do Mar. Instead of fighting coastal headwinds, they sailed boldly into the open Atlantic, catching deep ocean currents that pushed them safely back to Lisbon. But figuring out the Atlantic took decades. Moving south, the Portuguese built fortified trading posts in a dangerous mix of trade and violence with African kingdoms. Here we face a sad and defining truth of this expansion. By 1444, the first recorded shipment of enslaved Africans arrived in Portugal. This was not a side effect of the age of exploration. It became its dark foundation. It is a hard truth that must be said clearly. The sugar and gold that would soon flood Europe were built on forced labor. Treating human life as a product funded their exploration and set up a cruel system that would displace millions and cause immeasurable suffering for centuries. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople. The traditional gateways to the east were shut off, making the old overland highways impossibly dangerous and expensive. The slow Portuguese push down Africa suddenly became a desperate, high-stakes race to find the bottom of the world, going around the blockade to open a direct sea route to India. But as voyages pushed deeper into the unknown, the brutal reality of survival took hold. Men slept soaked in salt water, surviving on rotting meat and slimy green water. Then came the silent killer. Scurvy. Starved of nutrients, the human body essentially fell apart. Gums turned black. Old scars mysteriously tore open into fresh wounds. Men spent their final moments in dark ship holds hallucinating in terrible pain. Yet, while the crew fell apart below deck above deck, exploration was a cold and calculated science. Captains used astrolabes to measure latitude, but they had one blind spot: absolutely no way to measure longitude. To survive the east-west void, they relied on dead reckoning, staring at the rushing foam, guessing the ship's speed, and combining it with an hourglass and compass to plot their position on a blank map. It was an incredibly dangerous gamble. Every single detail was recorded in secret manuals known as roteros. These were the 15th century version of nuclear codes, guarded by kings with the harshest penalties. While foreign spies desperately tried to steal them in the shadows, the turning point came in 1488, when Captain Bartholomew Dias pushed further south than any European had dared. A massive 13-day storm battered his fleet, dragging them blindly into the open ocean. When the sea finally calmed, Dias steered east to find the African coast, but there was nothing but water. Realizing the storm had blown him past the continent, he turned north. Finally, land appeared. The coastline now stretched northeast. He had done it. The storm had dragged him completely around the southern tip of Africa, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. On the voyage home, he finally spotted the massive rocky peninsula they had been blown past and named it the Cape of Storms. But back in Lisbon, King João II instantly understood what it meant and renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, because if you could round Africa, you could reach India. The sea route to Asia was now open. By 1492, a newly united Spain was watching Portugal's success with envy. Fresh off the Reconquista, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were eager to compete for global wealth. Enter a persistent and ambitious sailor named Christopher Columbus. His idea was bold: forget the long route around Africa and reach Asia's spice markets simply by sailing west straight across the open Atlantic. But his entire plan was built on a huge mathematical error. He badly underestimated the size of the Earth. He first pitched his idea to Portugal, and they rejected him because their map experts knew his math was fatally wrong. No ship could carry enough food for an ocean that wide. He took his plan to Spain, and Spanish scholars also called his numbers impossible. But Spain was losing the sea race. Isabella and Ferdinand realized the ultimate prize was worth the risk of losing 3 small ships. They decided to bet on a math error. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail with 87 men heading west into the unknown. Weeks passed, with no land in sight, and the constant westbound wind filled the crew with dread about how they would ever sail back. Fear turned into thoughts of mutiny. They were sailing into a complete void. To manage the rising panic, Columbus kept 2 logs, a true one and a fake one, showing a shorter distance to hide how far they had truly gone. On October 12, 1492, after more than a month at sea, a lookout finally spotted land. Columbus stepped onto the Bahamas and encountered the indigenous Taino people, completely convinced he had reached the outer islands of Asia. He called them Indians. He was completely wrong. The world he had stumbled upon was entirely unknown to Europe, but was already home to millions of people. His mathematical mistake had delivered him straight into the heart of the Americas. The Spanish immediately raised their royal flags and claimed the land When Columbus spotted the Taino wearing gold ornaments, he saw the means to fund his greatest obsession, a holy crusade. Viewing the native people both as souls to be converted and bodies to be put to work, the mission violently shifted to extraction. The Spanish set up the encomienda system, a legal arrangement that forced indigenous people into brutal unpaid labor in mines and on plantations. But the most devastating European weapon was biological. Isolated for thousands of years, the Americas had zero natural immunity to old-world diseases like smallpox and measles. European ships were essentially floating biohazards. The result was a population disaster. Within decades, entire civilizations collapsed, wiping out more than half the native population in one of the worst disasters in human history. Yet this massive biological collision rewired the entire planet. Europeans brought horses, pigs, and deadly diseases to the Americas. In return, they took back potatoes, corn, and cassava. Historian Alfred Crosby famously named this the Columbian Exchange. These calorie-rich superfoods grew where traditional grains failed and triggered massive population explosions across Europe and Africa, and eventually helped triple the population of China. News of Columbus's voyage immediately created a crisis. Spain claimed they had found the shortcut to Asia. The Pope stepped in, drawing a boundary line that heavily favored Spain. Portugal, furious at the threat to its hard-earned monopoly, rejected the Pope's decision and prepared for war. To prevent a terrible conflict, the two rivals negotiated directly. In 1494, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. They took a map and drew a vertical line straight down the center of the globe, with everything to the west going to Spain and everything to the east belonging to Portugal. With a single stroke of a pen, two European nations divided the entire earth between themselves, completely ignoring the millions of people who already lived there. Portugal knew Columbus had returned with some gold and foreign plants, but crucially no spices. The true prize still waited around Africa. In July 1497, Vasco da Gama was sent to finish the job. Armed with highly classified roteros, he carried out an incredible move. He steered his 4 ships completely away from the coast, plunging deep into the South Atlantic void to catch the perfect winds. For 93 painful days and 10,000 kilometers, they saw absolutely nothing but water. After brutally fighting currents for a month to round the Cape of Good Hope, they pushed up East Africa into waters completely unknown to Europeans, but they did not find an empty sea. To their surprise, they stumbled into a highly advanced and busy trade network connecting Africa, the Persian Gulf, and India. After finding a local guide in what is now Kenya, da Gama crossed the Arabian Sea. On May 20, 1498, his anchors dropped in Calicut, India. The impossible was done. He had finally reached India by sea. The meeting with the local ruler was a deep cultural shock. Da Gama presented his gifts of striped cloth, brass basins, and honey to a society that traded in diamonds and fine silk. It was embarrassing. The wealthy merchants mocked the Portuguese as little more than dirty pirates. Leaving under serious hostility, da Gama managed to buy a small cargo of spices with gold. But the return voyage was a nightmare. Ignoring local warnings, he fought the Indian Ocean winds, and sickness wiped out half his crew, including his own brother. He was forced to burn one of his ships because there simply were not enough living men left to sail it. In September 1499, he limped back into Lisbon. The human cost was staggering. Of the 170 men who set sail, only 55 survived. The small cargo of spices he brought back sold for 60 times the cost of the entire expedition, proving that the direct sea route to India was worth pursuing. Soon after, Portuguese fleets crossed the Atlantic to claim Brazil, where they built a highly profitable sugar empire. As indigenous societies collapsed from disease, Portugal dramatically increased the transatlantic slave trade to keep it running, condemning millions of human beings to exhausting, shortened lives in the sugar fields. Portugal then learned a harsh truth. They could not compete in the East through trade because they had nothing Asia wanted. But they had one advantage. Their Atlantic-tested ships were floating fortresses armed with heavy bronze cannons. When they returned in 1502, it was not as humble merchants, but as conquerors. Using brutal naval firepower, they bombed coastal cities, sank fleets, and forced a violent monopoly on a world that had never invited them. While Portugal built its Eastern Empire, Spain was transforming the Americas. Hernán Cortés toppled the Aztec Empire with just 500 men, and Francisco Pizarro shattered the Inca Empire with even fewer. The motive was always the same: extract wealth, and above all, silver. In 1545, Potosi silver flooded the globe, crossing the Pacific on Manila galleons trading directly with China and permanently connecting the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia together for the first time in history. The Catholic Church also followed this new global trade with its own ideological mission. Jesuit missionaries mapping souls the same way navigators mapped coastlines. And as the 16th century came to a close, new rivals crashed in. The Dutch built the VOC, which was history's first multinational corporation, and broke Portugal's monopoly not with armies but with stolen knowledge. A Dutch insider published the classified Roteros handing control of the Indian Ocean to northern Europe. The English planted the aggressive seeds of their empire in North America at Jamestown. The world entered a new era. It was no longer just kings exploring the map, but massive joint stock companies waging corporate wars and ruling empires across thousands of miles of ocean around the globe. The age of exploration ended when the blank spaces on the map were filled in, but the machine it set in motion never stopped. When you eat a tomato in Italy, you are eating the legacy of the Columbian Exchange. When you drink coffee from Brazil, it is part of a system built on land and labor taken by force. The borders of many nations, the languages, the religions, the food, the diseases, all were shaped in the fires of this era. That is not a comfortable thought, and it should not be. But the ordinary people who dared the unknown could never have imagined the catastrophic and extraordinary results of their courage. For better or worse, we are the reality of a connected world that started 600 years ago.